how much power should a government have? Well, enough to do its job and no more. And in Federalist number 31, Alexander Hamilton uses pure logic to argue that the power to tax must be as broad as the responsibilities it supports, but that natural limits built into reason and representation will keep it all in check. I'm Matt Haskell. I'm a high school history teacher, and we're taking this trip through the Federalist Papers, all 85 of them, and we're up to number 31. So bear with me as we handle this rainy kind of night, so excuse me for any of the weird background noises. But anywho, so let's kind of set the stage here. So in Federalist number 30, Hamilton established that the Union must have the power to raise revenue for national purposes. But now he answers his critics, those who they fear that taxation power will just devour the states. His method isn't emotional or political. It's actually more mathematical. He treats government like a system of equations. So if A depends on B and B depends on C, then limiting C destroys A. So Hamilton begins with a principle that he calls axiomatic, which means self-evident. He says, or he writes, a government ought to contain in itself every power requisite to the full accomplishment of the objects committed to its care. And in other words, the federal government is responsible for defense or welfare and justice, then it must have the means to achieve them. And to deny the means is to deny the purpose. So Hamilton insists that power and purpose are bound by logic, not politics. So if the Constitution entrusts a goal to the federal government, it necessarily entrusts the means to reach it. So he writes again, it is a truth which the experience of all ages has attested, that every power ought to be proportionate to its object. So it's not about ambition, it's more about geometry. You cannot build a bridge with half of its supports, and you cannot secure liberty with half of a government. So, now, anti-federalists had claimed that if both the states and the federal government could tax, the states would be ruined. And Hamilton replies to that by saying the power to tax isn't a zero-sum game, but governments draw from the same source, the people. But they do so for different purposes and also within shared limits. He calls it a concurrent jurisdiction. So it's not a competition, it's actually cooperation. Hamilton argues that taxation is limited not by law, but instead by reason and necessity and consent. So governments can't tax endlessly because people won't tolerate it. Public opinions and elections are the natural boundaries of fiscal power. Once again, he writes, a sense of dependence on the people will naturally inspire caution in those entrusted with the administration of the finances. That's Hamilton's moral equilibrium. You have power that's balanced by accountability. So Hamilton's his writing in number 31 here feels almost like mathematical in its tone. And so he builds his argument step by step, kind of like a mathematical proof. First he says a government needs certain ends. And then he says those ends require certain means. And then those means include taxation. Therefore, taxation is inherent, not optional. So it's not ideology, it's more cause and effect. Now, some of the opponents wanted to place fixed legal caps on federal taxation. But Hamilton warns that this is both impractical and dangerous because emergencies can't be predicted, so limits made in peace might, doom the nation when it goes to war. So he insists that discretion must rest with those who are accountable to the people because only flexibility ensures survival. And he writes that to limit the discretion of the national councils in matters of revenue would be to limit the means of national preservation. So this means that Hamilton doesn't ask for a blind trust. He asks for more of a structural trust. The Constitution's checks and balances ensure that taxation remains a shared and public act. Congress must deliberate openly. representatives must answer to voters. And power, though broad, is never private. So it's not about trusting men, it's about trusting the mechanism that keeps the mechanisms that keep men honest. So let's look at the chain of reasoning here for Hamilton. So he says that 1, power must match purpose, or the purpose fails. 2, the Constitution entrusts national objectives to the Union. So 3, therefore it must also grant the means to fund them. The 4th point would be the limits of taxation come from reason, necessity, and public oversight. And finally, liberty is safer under rational power than under paralyzing fear. Once again, your homework summary is taken care of. You're welcome. You're welcome. Now, there's a kind of a calm when it comes to Hamilton's tone here, because there's this certainty that exists, because he's not pleading and he's not warning. He's in the mood for, he's teaching because he trusts logic to persuade where emotion can't. So for him, the Constitution isn't just political design, it's more moral geometry. So each power exists in balance, and each limit defined by nature, not panic. So today, the way that Hamilton's 31 here echoes in our modern times is his reasoning still resonates in debates about taxation and budgeting and government scope. His central point it remains timeless, because power and responsibility are inseparable. If you want that government that works, you must give it the means to do so and hold it accountable for how it uses them. Now, our takeaways today would be that government's powers must be equal to its purposes, and that both state and national governments share legitimate authority to tax, and the natural limits of taxation are built into consent and necessity. They're not arbitrary rules. So Federalist number 31 is Hamilton's kind of quiet, masterpiece is probably a bit too much, but you kind of get where I'm going here, because it's a fusion of political philosophy, but also mathematical logic. He's reminding America that good government isn't about extremes. It's not limitless authority, and it's not paralyzing restriction. It's about reason, which is the most revolutionary force of all. So, Matt Asquin, more things we should know by being alive. If this particular episode, if it helped you see how Hamilton built liberty on logic, share it, repost it, follow, stay tuned, because here comes number 32. And this is where Hamilton's going to explore how the states retain their own taxing powers under the Constitution, and why federalism is a partnership and not a hierarchy. Thanks for hanging around this long. I'll see you on the next one.